When tempted to overindulge, reach for a Lucky instead. It's toasted. How do you look in your bathing suit? Skinny? Thousands gain 10 to 25 pounds this new easy way. Get ready for the fat time of day. The sugar in a soft drink now can save me a lot of calories later. These meal replacement shakes are so good and they're helping me get my tummy back to flat. Hey everybody, it's LavenderTowne, and I'm fascinated by how rapidly beauty ideals change over time. So in this video, I wanted to look at ads, celebrities, poems, and parchments to literally draw every era's perfect woman. Let's see what changes, what stays the same, and why we're more obsessed with beauty than ever. To hold together my references and research, I'm using Milanote, which is the sponsor of today's video, but also just my favorite organizational tool. So here's the main board that I'm kind of using as like a table of contents for all the research. I've already filled most of these subboards with tons of articles, research, and photos, drawings, tapestries, anything that would get me inspired to get these illustrations as accurate as possible, and also just to kind of give me an overview of the beauty trends and ideals of the time. I ended up totally lost down a research hole while I was working on this, and I ended up using the Milanote web clipper, which is just a little browser extension that allows you to save any photo or article that you come across, and it will just end up in a little unsorted basket that you can then put into your board later. That was really useful to me because I didn't have to go back and forth between, all the stuff I was researching and the board until later when it was time to organize. So this is kind of how that works. And I like to put in notes with my pictures so that I actually remember why I wanted to include the picture. When you add in pictures or articles this way, Milanote also saves the source, which is really useful. So if you need to credit something, it's easy to do. So I'm gonna make a board for the 2020s because that's the one that I haven't done already. So as you can see, I'm just pulling in a bunch of articles and photos and trying to get all of like my loose ideas into a way that kind of makes sense to me. I'm a very visual person, so having all the pictures together really helps. I also like to use the little arrows that allow you to like point from pictures to notes or vice versa. You can make a little chain if you want to try to create like one sequence of information. I find that really useful for myself. You can also pull in a little like sketchbook widget that allows you to draw right into your board. I love this because sometimes you can't really explain it as well in a note as you can just by doodling something really quickly. So, for an artist, I think that that's fantastic. I had to add in a note about the mewing and all of that kind of like facial massage and facial exercise to try to change your face. Also like hunter versus prey eyes. I feel like there's been so many hyper specific like new insecurities and things that have popped up in the 2020s, and I do wonder, is this just something I noticed because I'm actually living through this era? Maybe there was ridiculously specific stuff like this in other decades, or is this because of social media and high-def cameras being pointed at our faces? It really does make me wonder. I also felt like because this is a more modern decade that I remember well and was here for, it's easier for me to detect like trends that were influenced by movies and pop culture, whereas I feel like that would be harder to track down in some of the other eras where I won't know if a particular hairstyle was necessarily inspired by an actress unless she's like as famous as Marilyn Monroe. In my 2020 board, I wanted to try to cover also the way that things shifted and changed. So like I mentioned, cottagecore kind of transforming over these last 5 years has been really interesting. I feel like cottagecore had a very different vibe or like cottagecore type items than they do now. And I feel like a lot of that sort of like pastoral kind of naturey aesthetic has turned into like a straight up like homesteader type of vibe, which is really intriguing because I feel like they're serving two very different communities, and yet the dresses and the aesthetic itself haven't actually changed that much. It's wild how colors and aesthetics can mean such different things to different communities at different times. Honestly, I could keep working on these boards forever. I kind of love doing this type of research, and especially like being able to just drag and drop in random notes and images. And it's really great to be able to go back to articles that I found important or interesting, because I used to have to dig through my history for that, and that is not very fun. Milanote's also really useful if you're working on a project with somebody else because you can share the board and work on it together. You can also leave comments to each other, heckling each other's work, which I think is a very valuable and fun feature. I personally find this method of organization really easy and fun to use. The way you can group stuff together, move it around, and basically put in whatever you want is just really helpful to me. I'm actually using Milanote for my own personal projects outside of YouTube. So if you have a project that you would like to get organized, try out Milanote. There is a link in the description. It's free and it's browser-based, so you don't actually have to download anything. Good luck on all your projects, guys, and thank you again to Milanote for sponsoring this video. So our first character is going to be based on the beauty standards of the 1600s. Now this is a much wider swath of time than I have done for the other characters that you're going to see. So I'm going to be a little more general here, but that is actually useful because this is definitely one of the hardest eras in the video to research. We don't obviously have any advertisements or celebrities really to work from. So I'm mainly working off a lot of historical papers as well as some like writings of the time period where it was discussed kind of what the most beautiful woman is, what she looks like, and you may find that these beauty standards are quite different than what you're used to. One of the things that definitely stood out to me was this desire to have a really high hairline and also to completely shave off your eyebrows or have very, very fair eyebrows. The idea was that if your hairline is really pushed back and you tweeze off your eyelashes and your eyebrows, the only color on your face is like your eyes, which makes them stand out more. There was a very big taboo against actually using makeup. Sometimes women would still use a little bit of like some cosmetic techniques, like with some berries or like a little bit of soot in some places, but generally wearing makeup was like against God and very seriously considered to be a taboo. So there were other things that women would do to try to control their appearance. Wearing opals was believed to make you more blonde and prevent your hair from darkening as you aged. So that's something that women would do. I'm putting all the characters in like this little bodysuit that shows the topography of their body type more, and then I just kind of have a ghost of the types of clothes they were wearing. I didn't want the costuming to like totally distract from what we're really talking about here. Her body type is fascinating. So the ideal body type at the time was a relatively small frame with an elongated torso and a little bit of a pot belly. There are multiple references about the chest not being too large and this idea that the frame should ideally have a layer of soft fat over it so that you can't see like the collarbones or tendons. Overall, like a soft, smooth kind of look for the whole figure was considered very desirable. Big eyes and a small mouth were considered very desirable as well, and the overall softness also was including in like the jaw area. You wouldn't want that super like mewing sharp jawbone at this time. Personality-wise, the most popular attributes for women was being very mild-mannered, very quiet, very chaste, very innocent. Next, we're creating a character around the ideals of the 1920s. Now, this was a huge stylistic shift. This is right around the time that women were getting the right to vote, which I think is why there was such a dramatic moment for women's independence when it came to style. It was a really abrupt change from their, Victorian mothers who had like this super curvaceous figure they were trying to cut. Really long hair. Everything was about being very soft and feminine. The flappers came out and basically went against all of that. They started cutting their hair really, really short to the point where most of the time they would have to not go to salons and actually go to barber shops. It was the only way they would get their hair cut as short as they wanted. The figure changed dramatically. So it was generally considered best to have a slender figure that was just very straight straight. So we're not going for like an hourglass like had been sort of dominant for quite a while before, with stays and corsets kind of really helping inform that shape. Now it was all about kind of just having these loose fitting, easy to move in outfits that allowed for more dancing, and just more freedom of movement in general. There's also a big moment for like entertainment and, like jazz clubs and that sort of thing. Josephine Baker and Mary Pickford were both kind of celebrities that I looked to for references on like what was really popular in a contemporary sense at this time. And both of those women have lived very fascinating lives that ended up being about quite a bit more than just how they look. Josephine Baker in particular, she was a spy. I really recommend looking her up if you're interested in this era at all, because it's pretty fascinating. This style was actually pretty transgressive and had a lot of haters at the time. There were a lot of men in particular who would write op-eds about how it kind of indicated low morals and was ugly because their hair was too short and that sort of thing. But the flappers left an indelible mark on glamour and fashion, and it was a really great moment for like experimental self-expression. Like sometimes you see this knee painting thing, just some really whimsical and out there stuff. This is also a moment where women were trying to wear pants more and wear bathing suits that didn't like completely cover them down to the ankles. Women would get arrested for some of this stuff, so it was definitely a really interesting experimental moment that changed fashion forever. Next, we're designing a character based on the beauty standards of the 1950s. Now, the 1950s was all about the hourglass figure, so much so that I actually found more ads about gaining weight than losing it for the first time. In the 1920s, there were plenty of ads encouraging you to smoke cigarettes so that you would be extra skinny and slender. Here, I kept finding ads for formulas and ironized yeast that were pretty harsh against skinny girls and basically implied that men will literally run away from you because you're too skinny and you need to eat their yeast so that you can gain firm flesh, 10 to 25 pounds of it. It honestly is such a trip to see advertisers like demeaning different body types at different eras in exactly the same way. Like it's always this threat that you'll end up like lonely and loveless and everyone secretly thinks that you're hideous, but what the actual body type is doesn't really matter. As long as they have a way to sell you something, they're happy. So the interesting thing about the 1950s housewife as like a marketing concept is it was really being pushed quite aggressively, partially because this lifestyle made a good consumer. Like a housewife is someone who's constantly having to buy food and cleaning supplies and various different things for the house, but also because in the 1940s, during the war effort, so many men were taken out of the labor force that women were kind of allowed to do a variety of jobs that they had never had access to before. And so there was this big idea that we needed to push women back into the home once the men returned to right the natural order of things. And there were a lot of women who actually liked going to work and didn't want to go back to being sort of like confined within the domestic sphere. So it's interesting to think about because there is like a political bent to a lot of this marketing material and this idea of like who is the ideal woman at this time. It's really interesting to think about because you see a lot of advertising and a lot of images of women that are kind of exactly the opposite of what was being encouraged just 10 years earlier. Really going overboard on this idea that women are more childlike, weaker, and just generally less capable of things that men are able to do. Some features I noticed a lot in like makeup ads and the celebrities who were popular at the time was these sort of like heavily lidded cat-like eyes, as well as a big smile with a well-defined Cupid's bow on the lips. Next, we're going to talk about the beauty ideal of the 1970s. The 70s were an interesting era. I think a lot of people associate it with like hippies, free love, and kind of just a trailing off of a lot of stuff that started in the 1960s. Twiggy was a very famous fashion model at this time, and she kind of first got popular in the 60s. eating disorders do hit their peak in America during this time, and they've stayed relatively stable ever since. And I think that that does make some sense with how slender and elongated the beauty standard is in the 1970s. It was even more extreme, I would say, in the 1960s. In the 70s, you also are expected to have sort of this like Dorito shape where you're a little heavier on the top, but then very, very slender throughout. There's also some really interesting makeup trends that kind of appear here. Some more interesting freeform and like colorful kind of eye makeup gets more popular, and this kind of dramatic, very like lashy kind of eye looks as well. Big fluffy feathered hair comes into popularity. And this is one of the first eras where I really noticed more prevalence of like freckles and tans and different types of skin. It's a little bit less like aggressively porcelain versus some of the other eras I've looked at so far. I still do think that the beauty standard was very like blonde and blue-eyed, but it was one of the first times that I started to see more appreciation and representation of like Black beauty in advertising and just kind of like in fashion and various other places in the 1970s. And I think that makes sense because this was a big era for a lot of different progressive movements. So I think that that reflected in the greater expanding of like celebrities and beauty and models that we were seeing at the time. When I was doing research for this era, one of the things that was cracking me up was I found a bunch of diet ads, some of which look very similar to the diet foods that we still have today. But one of the campaigns that I kept seeing that were coming out in this era was this campaign for sugar, that were basically saying it was like a diet food because it's all energy, and basically that it would save you calories if you had more sugar. It really just reminds you that like marketing people can just lie. They can just lie right to you and give you bad advice. Next, I'm going to design a character based on the beauty standards of the 2000s. Now, this era was pretty dark. It was pretty harsh. Thin was in just like it was in the 1970s, but maybe it's just because I was alive for this era. It feels even more like dark and miserable. The celebrities that they would rake over the coals for being too heavy, who I think it genuinely seems like delusional by our modern standards, you know? And then you look at the celebrities who were like thin enough in people's eyes, and it's a little miserable. I definitely think that the reason that the body positivity movement got so much energy in the 2010s is just because like people lived through this era and hated it and had a really hard time and got a bunch of complexes, so we really needed the pendulum to swing because it was pretty rough. One of the things that I really like from this era was the sort of like futuristic vibe of a lot of like cosmetics and technology. There was a lot of like clear plastic electronics, which I love. I also like the kind of frosty look and like glossy look in a lot of makeup at this time. Chunky highlights were a big thing in this era, I remember. I think personality wise there was a very big like mean girl energy, probably because everyone was so hungry. But there was definitely like a major mean streak to a lot of the media that was going on. I think shows like America's Next Top Model, as well as some other really like bottom of the barrel content, was kind of going on unchallenged, and it had very much this vibe of like, we're just keeping it real, we're just being honest, and like if that hurts your feelings, too bad. That was very much the energy at the time. I think that's part of the reason why like emo as a subculture was kind of centered around this idea of like being emotional and sincere, which is interesting to think back on. A lot of the times we associate like these goth or like darker kind of visual aesthetics with being more like aggressive, but I think especially in this era it was quite the opposite, because the mainstream was so sort of like harsh and like out for yourself. The alt kids were just like more sensitive, which I think is kind of cute. But you know, take my assessment with a grain of salt, because I was an emo back then, and I considered myself very counterculture, so I am quite biased. As a wrap up, I just want to remind you guys that when you're feeling bad about yourself, a lot of beauty is just temporary trends and marketing. So next time someone tries to sell you ironized yeast or figurines chocolate bars or fat-free dessert yogurt or skinny tea, you should just tell them to scram, because they're just trying to make you feel bad to part you with your money and maybe offload some yeast. Thank you so much for watching the video. Thank you to Milanote for sponsoring it, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you so much to my wonderful members and patrons, including Philip Verbicario, Celery Sticks, I'm a Potato, Prince Piplup III, Honey Kitten, Nee Nico, Novel Goblin, Loro, Dada, Lily McFarlane, Artist James, Skitten, Gold Pikachu, Clad, Songbird Galesworth, Sunshine, Whimsic, Asri Cryptid, Hoodle Doodle, River the Goblin, Raz Tarosh, Kobe Octo VTuber, Graveyard Moss, Grexius, Maddie Momo, The Midwestern Menace, CB, Lucy Amajiki, Live Live, Ravens Crow, Zossalot, T-Hill Music, Jabber Dabber Doo, Light Jewel, Kadaria, The Expressive Poker Face, Tsubaki, Cutie Pie, Ice Cream Pal, Kola, JJ Jade, and of course, Lib Lib Blah.